Welcome to the Global Board Institute's Super Forecaster Geopolitical Crisis Briefing for the week of March the 26th, 2026. I'm presenting this week's board-level analytical briefing on the Israeli-Iranian war and its global implications. My name is Steve, and yes, this is my AI avatar. This is issue number 2 in our weekly series. It is day 26 of active conflict following the coordinated US-Israeli strikes on Iran launched on February 28th. The most significant development this week is the emergence of a diplomatic track. President Trump has transmitted a 15-point peace plan to Iran via Pakistan, and Iran's foreign minister has confirmed it is under review by top authorities in Tehran, even while publicly denying any negotiations are taking place. At the same time, the military situation continues to evolve. Israel is expanding ground operations in Lebanon toward the Litani River. Iraqi militia attacks have hit their highest tempo since the war began. And oil prices, while easing from their peak of over $120, remain in triple-digit crisis territory. This briefing is classified board confidential and is intended exclusively for board directors, C-suite leaders, and senior governance professionals, members of the Global Chairs and Board Directors Network. It is not investment, legal, political, military, or financial advice. Let's begin. Before we proceed, a brief but important disclaimer. This briefing is for informational purposes only. All documented facts presented today are sourced and cited from credible outlets. Where we move into analytical inference or probabilistic forecasting that is clearly labeled throughout. Our super forecasting probabilities represent best estimates as of this morning, March 26th, and are subject to rapid change given the volatility of the situation. You will notice several probability shifts from last week's briefing, which we will call out explicitly as we go through each slide. This briefing does not constitute legal, financial, political, military, or investment advice. We encourage all board members to consult their own relevant professional advisors when making governance decisions based on the intelligence presented here. Let me walk you through our methodology and sources so you understand the rigor behind this briefing. We employ a super forecasting framework that combines 4 core disciplines: base rate analysis, trajectory extrapolation, scenario modeling, and Bayesian probability updating. Every probability you see in this briefing is the result of that structured analytical process, and every number will be updated weekly as conditions evolve. Our primary sources include the world's leading think tanks and research institutions, from CSIS and RAND to the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists and the IAEA. For real-time developments, we draw from a broad spectrum of international news sources, including Al Jazeera, Reuters, Bloomberg, CNBC, CNN, Axios, and regional outlets like Arab News and The National. This week, we have added several new analytical inputs, including the UNI shipping tracker for Hormuz transit data, the Freightos Index for container shipping costs, and the ACLED Conflict Data Project for their Middle East special issue. For governance frameworks, we continue to reference Harvard Law's Corporate Governance Forum, the World Economic Forum's Global Risks Report for 2026, and establish standards like ISO 31000 for risk management. This is not opinion. This is structured analysis built on verifiable data. Let's begin with the executive summary. 5 critical headlines that every board member needs to understand this morning. First, active war, day 26. US and Israeli forces have now struck over 8,000 targets inside Iran, up from 7,000 last week. Mojtaba Khamenei, installed as supreme leader on March 9th, is consolidating power with IRGC backing. There is still no ceasefire, but a diplomatic channel has opened. Second, multi-front war continues across 5 theaters. The most significant escalation this week is Israel's ground operation in Lebanon, which is now expanding toward the Litani River. In Iraq, Iranian-backed militias hit 21 US bases in a single 24-hour period on March 22nd, the highest tempo since the war began. Lebanon's death toll has risen from 886 to over 1,070 in just 1 week. Third, energy crisis shows its first signs of market adjustment. Brent crude has eased from the $100 to $126 range to $99 to $102, partly on Trump's diplomatic signals. But Hormuz transits have actually worsened, down to just 16 ships in the past week from 21 last week. Container shipping costs are now up 150%, far worse than the 40% we reported last week. Fourth, nuclear risk remains acute, but the picture is evolving. The IAEA cannot access the Natanz facility because entrance buildings were destroyed in the strikes. A new underground enrichment facility at Isfahan remains unverified. Iran's foreign minister offered to downblend enriched material, but the two sides' demands remain far apart. Fifth, board action takes on new urgency because the diplomatic window creates a dual-track planning requirement. Boards must now prepare for both a negotiated outcome and continued escalation simultaneously. Let me now give you the operational picture across all 5 active fronts, updated from last week. The numbers at the top show continued escalation in scale. Over 8,000 US strikes have hit targets inside Iran, up from 7,000 last week. Iran has fired more than 3,500 projectiles, up from 3,000. The estimated Iranian death toll remains at 5,300 plus, based on the Hengar organization's March 18th estimate. And Hormuz transits have actually declined further to just 16 ships in the past 7 days, down from approximately 21 the week before. On the Iran front itself, the big development is diplomatic. Trump's 15-point plan has been transmitted to Tehran via Pakistan. It demands dismantling of nuclear sites, end to enrichment, suspension of the ballistic missile program, and full Hormuz reopening. Iran is reviewing it, but publicly denies any negotiations. Iran has countered with 5 conditions of its own, including a halt to aggression, war reparations, and international recognition of Hormuz sovereignty. In Lebanon, the situation has escalated significantly. Israel's 91st Division has launched ground operations in the south, and senior Israeli officials are now openly discussing expanding control to the Litani River. President Aoun has warned this is a prelude to full invasion. Deaths have risen from 886 to over 1,070, with more than 1 million displaced. In Gaza, the Phase 2 ceasefire remains fragile. The risk here is that any Gaza deterioration could trigger Houthi re-escalation in the Red Sea. Across the GCC, the UAE alone has received 2,187 projectiles, 357 ballistic missiles, 1,815 drones, and 15 cruise missiles. All 6 states remain under fire with over 40 killed or injured across the region. And in Iraq, the tempo of militia attacks reached its highest point on March the 22nd, with 21 attacks on US installations in a single 24-hour period. Now, let's move to what boards really need: forward-looking scenario analysis. And this is where we have some significant probability shifts from last week. Our base case has been revised upward from 45 to 50%. Last week, we assessed this at 45%. This week, based on the emergence of Trump's 15-point plan and active mediation channels, we have revised that to 50%. The opening of a diplomatic track via Pakistan and Oman represents the first structural change in the conflict dynamics since February 28th. Our escalation scenario has been revised downward from 30 to 25%. Last week, we assessed this at 30%. This week, based on the diplomatic opening, we have revised that to 25%. The diplomatic channel reduces but does not eliminate the risk. The IRGC's autonomous cell structure still poses an escalation risk beyond political intent. Regime change remains at 15%, unchanged from last week. Mojtaba Khamenei has consolidated IRGC support more quickly than some analysts expected, reducing the near-term probability of internal collapse. And the wildcard scenario remains at 10%, also unchanged. The continued Houthi pause and the absence of full Hormuz closure keep this at the same level. The net shift this week is towards the diplomatic track, which is why we have moved 5 percentage points from escalation to base case. But I want to emphasize, Iran's public rejection of talks means this diplomatic window could close as quickly as it opened. This slide addresses the 2 time horizons that matter for governance: the ceasefire horizon and the lasting peace horizon. On the ceasefire probability window, the current window through April has doubled from 5 to 10%. Last week, there was no diplomatic framework. This week, we have Trump's 15-point plan under review and active mediation by Pakistan, Oman, Turkey, and Egypt. May through July rises from 35% to 40% as we expect diplomatic engagement to formalize, particularly if Iran's munitions continue to deplete. August through December decreases slightly from 45% to 40%, because some of that probability mass has shifted earlier given the active diplomatic track. Beyond 2027 drops from 15% to 10% for the same reason. The scenario where this drags on for over a year becomes less likely with active diplomacy. On the right side, lasting sustainable peace. We have added Iran's 5 conditions to the prerequisites list. The gap between Trump's 15 demands and Iran's 5 conditions defines the negotiation space. Our assessment remains unchanged, a 5 to 15-year horizon for a sustainable regional peace framework. There is no precedent for resolution within the current power dynamics. It requires generational leadership change in multiple nations. Now, let's turn to what this means for business, starting with energy and supply chains, where we have significant updates. The headline numbers show a mixed picture. Brent crude has eased to $99 to $102 from $100 to $126 last week. This is driven partly by Trump's diplomatic signals. But Hormuz transits have worsened further, down to just 16 ships in the past week from 21 last week. The most alarming new data is container shipping costs. Last week, we reported a 40% increase. This week, comprehensive data shows costs are up 150%, with the Shanghai Containerized Freight Index at COVID-era highs. The Cape of Good Hope rerouting adds 10 to 14 days to Asia-Europe voyages. 3 critical choke points demand continued board attention. The Strait of Hormuz remains under selective blockade. Bab el-Mandeb and the Red Sea remain in a fragile Houthi pause. The Suez Canal is operating at reduced capacity, with CMA-CGM imposing a $3,000 per container emergency surcharge. And the structural shift is reinforced this week by Goldman Sachs forecasting triple-digit oil for years, not months. Boards should plan for a permanently elevated cost base. Let me walk you through the business impact region by region, updated with this week's data. In the United States, the defense sector picture has evolved. The ITA ETF is up about 10% since the war began, though it has pulled back from its March 2nd peak. Individual stocks remain strong. RTX up 68% year over year, Lockheed Martin up 35% year to date. Trump's winding down rhetoric introduces new uncertainty for defense sector investors. In Europe, gas prices remain doubled. The key development is growing momentum for a joint European push for UN-mediated talks. In the Asia-Pacific, the container shipping cost increase from 40% to 150% is the most material change for this region. China's 50% crude dependency on the Gulf remains the critical strategic vulnerability. In the GCC, Saudi Arabia continues to face the most severe impact. NEOM construction contracts have been cancelled. FDI is down 60% to 70%. An estimated 5,000 American workers have left or are preparing to depart. And in North Africa, the pattern from last week continues with declining Suez revenues and food price inflation. Let's drill deeper into the GCC, because for many of our members, this is where the governance decisions are most acute. Saudi Arabia remains rated critical. NEOM contracts have been cancelled this week, not just suspended. The 5,000 American worker departures represent a brain drain that compounds the FDI decline. The kingdom's $840 billion investment portfolio is under the most severe stress since Vision 2030 launched. The UAE, rated high risk, has received 2,187 total projectiles, 357 ballistic missiles, 1,815 drones, and 15 cruise missiles. Despite this extraordinary volume, the diversified economy is proving relatively resilient. At least 58 people have been injured. Qatar remains high risk following the Ras Laffan gas facility strike. 16 people were injured. Qatar's mediator role becomes complicated when its own critical infrastructure is being targeted. Kuwait, rated high, saw 32 people injured in attacks. US military bases continue to be targeted, and limited diversification leaves it highly exposed. Bahrain is rated critical with US 5th Fleet headquarters under direct targeting and 4 people injured. Its small, concentrated economy is the most vulnerable in the GCC. Oman has a nuanced medium assessment. While least targeted, its critical mediator role in relaying messages between the US and Iran makes it strategically invaluable. This is the governance action slide, and I want to be direct. This is the most important slide in the briefing for every board member. We have updated the 30-day column to reflect the new diplomatic reality. In addition to the 5 actions from last week, we have added assess the 15-point plan implications for your sector. Because if that plan advances, the implications for sanctions relief, energy markets, and regional investment flows will be profound and sector-specific. In the next 30 days, boards must activate geopolitical risk as a standing board agenda item, convene an emergency risk committee session, map supply chain exposure, review sanctions compliance, stress test financial models, and now assess what a diplomatic resolution would mean for your business. In 60 days, establish dedicated geopolitical risk oversight, implement scenario-based planning, begin dual sourcing supply chains, review insurance coverage, update crisis communications. In 90 to 180 days, restructure governance for sustained uncertainty, build geopolitical literacy programs, develop adaptive strategy frameworks, and consider regional rebalancing. The key message this week is dual-track preparation. Plan for both diplomacy and escalation. Beyond specific actions, the way boards lead must fundamentally change. Let me walk through 6 critical shifts. From predictive to adaptive. Trump's shifting stance from threatening power plant strikes to touting peace talks within 48 hours perfectly illustrates why prediction fails. Build optionality into every major decision. From reactive to anticipatory. Track forward-looking indicators, the 15-point plan progress, Iran's response timeline, Hormuz transits, and militia attack tempo. From neutral to positioned, Iran's 5 conditions and Trump's 15 points define the negotiation space. Boards must understand where they stand. From siloed to integrated, the diplomatic track adds a political risk dimension. Cross-committee coordination is essential. From confident to humble. No one predicted February 28th. No one predicted Trump's pivot to diplomacy 3 weeks later. And from distant to engaged. With diplomatic developments potentially moving daily, quarterly meetings are dangerously insufficient. Monthly briefings are the minimum. This is your monitoring dashboard. Compare this week's numbers with last week carefully. The most notable change is in oil prices. Brent crude has eased to $99 to $102, technically touching the amber zone boundary. This is driven by Trump's diplomatic signals, not by any fundamental supply improvement. Hormuz transits remain in deep red at 16 per week. Last week, all 8 indicators were in the red zone. This week, 7 of 8 remain firmly in red. Oil prices are right at the red-amber boundary, which is the first positive movement since the conflict began. Container shipping costs have dramatically worsened to 150% above baseline. The IAEA access situation complicates nuclear breakout assessment. 7 of 8 indicators remain in red zone. The oil price easing represents the first structural change since the conflict began. But the underlying supply disruption has not improved. Boards should treat this as the most severe risk environment since 1973, with the first potential off-ramp now visible but far from certain. Here is our weekly forecast for March 26th through April 2nd, with probability assignments compared to last week. At 90%, down from 95%, no formal ceasefire this week. We have lowered this slightly because the diplomatic track is now active. At 70%, this is new. Iran will respond formally to Trump's 15-point plan via mediators. At 85%, down from 90%, oil prices remain above $95 a barrel. At 85%, unchanged, Iranian strikes continue declining consistent with munition depletion. At 80%, up from 75%, Israel expands ground operations toward the Litani River. At 85%, up from 80%, Iraqi militia attacks continue at elevated tempo following the March 22nd record. At 65%, down from 70%, Houthis maintain their pause. This is our most fragile forecast. At 75% new, Trump makes further winding down statements. At 55%, up from 50%, IAEA reports further concerns about the Isfahan facility. And at 60%, up from 55%, European leaders intensify UN talks push. Our overall confidence remains moderate high, but the diplomatic track creates wider uncertainty than last week. Let me close with the most important message of this entire briefing. This is not a temporary disruption, but for the first time since February 28th, a diplomatic window is opening. The structural conditions that produced this conflict will persist well beyond any ceasefire. But Trump's 15-point plan and Iran's 5 conditions now define a negotiation space that did not exist last week. 4 imperatives for every board member. First, treat geopolitical risk with the same rigor as financial and cyber risk. Second, monitor the diplomatic track closely. Trump's 15 demands and Iran's 5 conditions define the negotiation space. The gap is enormous, but the fact that they exist is new and significant. Third, build resilience, not prediction. This week's 48-hour swing from power plant threats to peace talks shows why adaptive governance beats predictive governance every time. And fourth, act now. The boards that respond within 30 days will lead. Those that wait 180 days will follow. This has been the Global Board Institute's Super Forecaster Geopolitical Crisis Briefing for the week of March the 26th, 2026. We will be back next Thursday with updated forecasts, scenario probabilities, and governance recommendations. Thank you for your attention. Stay vigilant. Stay prepared.